Have you ever wondered why, just when you thought you had found the light, your heart quietly sank into a darkness deeper than ever before? I remember that moment in my life so vividly. One summer night, I sat alone on the balcony, staring out at the dim yellow lights of the city. Something inside me had collapsed. A curtain that had long covered the world suddenly fell away, revealing everything. The illusions, the games, the meaningless cycles I once believed were my life's purpose. And then, silence. At first, it was a powerful moment. I felt free. It was like taking off a suffocating mask I had worn for years. I took a deep breath, believing that everything would change from here. I would live authentically. I would be free. I would burn with a new fire. But as the days passed, I began to notice something strange. That fire never ignited. On the contrary, it slowly faded. It wasn't a sudden extinguishing, not a dramatic crisis, but a quiet, smoldering stillness, as if the volume of my soul was being turned down, notch by notch, until there was almost no sound left at all. I stopped chasing the goals that once kept me up at night. I stopped caring about the things that used to make me leap out of bed in the morning. Not because I became indifferent, not because I wanted to rebel against life, but simply because I no longer felt anything. A question began to echo inside me, clearer with each passing day. Why do I feel numb right after seeing the truth? It felt like a bitter paradox. I used to believe that spiritual awakening would open the door to a life full of meaning, but instead of a radiant dawn, I found myself wandering through a long twilight, where the light had not yet broken through and the darkness had already swallowed every color. Can you imagine it? Years of yearning for the light, and when I finally touched it, what I received was only a quiet void. No more desires, no more motivation, no more arrows pointing me forward. I thought back to the old days. Back then, I lived in a frantic cycle of ambition, achievement, recognition. I told myself that once I had those things, life would be full and brilliant. Then, one moment of awakening pulled the curtain from my eyes. It was all just a game. And yes, I was no longer fooled. But from that moment on, I also felt empty. It didn't feel like depression in the usual sense. There were no panic attacks, no shadow of despair looming overhead, just a silence so intense, it felt suffocating, as if the whole world kept moving, and I stood still by the roadside, no longer wanting to take a single step. Some people call that state liberation, but I didn't feel free. I felt like a boat that had cut its anchor, drifting into the open sea, but with no wind to sail, no map to navigate, a directionless drift. And in that drifting, a quiet fear crept in. Is this the end? Have I lost the very thing that makes us feel alive? Desire, longing, the drive to act? Or is this just a bend in the road whose meaning I have yet to understand? I began to realize that in this journey, I wasn't alone. Many people, deep, sensitive souls, seekers of truth, have told me of similar experiences. They too had stood at this very crossroads. The moment they touched awakening, they fell into a space of lost motivation. A close friend once told me, after going through the dark night of the soul, I used to cry because I feared I wasn't doing enough, that I wasn't successful enough. But now, I don't even care whether I do anything at all. I just lie there, staring at the ceiling, with no reason to get up. That sentence echoed through my soul. It repeated the question I had been carrying. Wasn't awakening supposed to set me on fire? So why do I feel like ashes? From that point on, a new thought began to grow in me. Maybe we've all misunderstood what awakening really means. Maybe what I'm going through is not a failure, not a depletion, but an essential part of the journey. But if that's true, then what is its real meaning? That night, when the noise of the city had faded, I sat with myself. I didn't try to escape. I didn't force myself to be positive again. I simply sat in stillness, placed my hand on my chest, and listened to the emptiness. And in that quiet, I felt something very small, but very real. This is not the end. This is a threshold we can only cross if we dare to embrace the emptiness. And when that thought sparked, I suddenly remembered a philosopher once said, "Light is not always found in the spark. Sometimes it is hidden within the very darkness we once feared." Perhaps, I thought, the silence after awakening is not a mistake. It is an invitation to go deeper, to let go of old motivations, to prepare to discover something entirely new. But what is this new thing? Where does it come from? And how do we cross this void without losing ourselves? That is the question I carried with me. And it became the door that led me to an even greater discovery, one I will share with you in the next part. Death does not always arrive in the form of despairing darkness. Sometimes it comes as a silence. And only when we dare to face that silence do we begin to see what waits on the other side. After days of wandering through that silence, I began to notice something. I was not the only one. A close friend of mine, let's call her Emily, had gone through the same thing. Emily is the kind of person you would think had figured it all out. She's intelligent, deeply intuitive, and sensitive to even the smallest vibrations of the world. Her bookshelf is packed with titles by Eckhart Tolle, Alan Watts, and Krishnamurti. She would quote philosophical passages as if they were part of her daily breath. Then one day, after a long period of inner crisis, what many call the dark night of the soul, she had a breakthrough. Emily said it felt like a veil had been ripped away from her mind. Everything became clear. She saw the illusion of the ego, the games of status, the meaninglessness behind the races that society glorifies. I remember the look in her eyes as she told me this. It was pure, trembling, as if she had glimpsed another sky. And in that moment, I truly believed Emily had found her path to freedom. But just 2 months later, I saw her again in a dimly lit room. Emily lay stretched out on the sofa, eyes staring blankly at the white ceiling. She was no longer the radiant woman I had seen before. Instead, she seemed like a shadow, silent and heavy. I sat beside her and gently asked, "How are you?" Emily didn't look at me. She just gave a faint, tired smile. It's strange. I used to cry because I thought I wasn't doing enough, wasn't successful enough. Now, I don't even care whether I do anything at all. That sentence pierced straight into my heart. Because I was in that same state, she went on, whispering like a drifting breeze. I thought awakening would set me on fire. But it didn't. It left me here, as if the whole world had disappeared. We sat in silence. Neither of us said another word. I could feel the thick loneliness surrounding us both. It wasn't a loud despair. It was more like a long, soundless breath, stretching endlessly. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a personal issue. Something deeper, more universal, was happening in the souls of those who seek the truth. Days later, I happened to revisit a passage from Carl Jung, the psychologist often called the explorer of the inner darkness. There, I came across a quote I had never truly understood. Until now, enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. At first, it sounded beautiful. But when I placed it alongside the experiences of Emily and of myself, it became unsettling. Because if Jung was right, then awakening is not a celebration of light. It's an excavation, a deep digging into the layers of darkness we've buried, the pain, the collapse, the death of the identity we once clung to in order to survive. Suddenly, I understood why Emily lay there staring at the ceiling, and why I had fallen into that same hollow silence. We hadn't failed. We were simply walking through the part of the awakening journey that few ever speak of, the dark part. You see, society tells this story differently. They say that after awakening, your life will be full of energy. You'll dance through fields, laughing under the sundae. But that's only half the picture. The other half is the quiet collapse. And maybe this is the paradox. The death of the ego doesn't always come with fierce battles. Sometimes it arrives in silence. It peels away old motivations, outdated goals, dreams built to please others. It takes everything until all that's left is a terrifying emptiness. That night, after leaving Emily's home, I wandered under the city sky. Neon lights reflected on the rain-slicked streets, sparkling like illusions. I felt like someone lost between two worlds, one that had collapsed and another that had yet to appear. Inside me, Jung's words echoed again. Enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. I started to understand that Emily and I hadn't lost our motivation. We were standing at a threshold, a stage no one prepares you for, a space where the old self has died, but the new one has not yet been born. People often think of awakening as the destination, but Jung, with the patience of an inner explorer, revealed that it is only the beginning. And after that beginning, comes a psychological death. That death takes away the familiar maps, takes away the old flame, leaving us to drift in the void. But maybe, only by entering that void, do we create space for something else, a true flame, to be born. When I thought about that, I felt a little lighter, just a little. Not a burst of joy, not a surge of inspiration, but a quiet nod to myself. So that's what this island. I knew I still had to go deeper into this journey, and I also knew to understand it more fully, I had to return to what Jung revealed about psychological death, about the ego's loss of direction, and about why emptiness itself might be the gateway to a new life. But that is the story of the next part. If awakening is not the end, but the beginning of a death, then what exactly is dying within us? And when that death arrives, what will be left? There is something strange that happens after awakening, something few people talk about. You no longer feel like yourself. Not in the sense of becoming someone else, but like a quiet dissolution from within. The familiar self, the one who chased goals, longed for more, kept running, suddenly disappears. I remember waking up one morning as sunlight streamed through the window. In the past, sunlight meant it was time to start the day, work, to-do lists, goals to accomplish. But that day, the sunlight was just sunlight. It lit up the wall, soft and quiet. I lay there with no motivation to get up. Some might call that laziness, but it felt much deeper. It was as if I had lost a map that had guided me for years. I no longer knew where to go, what to do, or even why I should do anything at all. Jung once wrote that awakening is not a burst of light, but an opening into darkness. And the first darkness is the collapse of the old map, the belief system, the values, the goals that once gave our lives meaning. Imagine it this way. We live our whole lives as if climbing a mountain. Every day, we take one more step, believing the summit will bring us the reward. Then one day, you awaken and realize the mountain was an illusion. So you let go. And in that moment, you see no other mountain to climb. In Jungian psychology, this is known as the collapse of the ego structure. The ego doesn't completely disappear. It's still there, but the map it once relied on is gone. It becomes lost, confused, and no longer fuels you the way it used to. One evening, I sat in a dark room, trying to write down what I wanted to do. In the past, that list would have stretched across pages, work, learning, personal goals. But now, the page before me remained blank. Everything that once excited me felt meaningless. I held the pen, then put it down. There was nothing left to write. This is the feeling of psychological death. There's no funeral, no tolling bells, just a quiet falling away. A part of you dissolves, and you don't know what's left. It's both terrifying and strange, because the part that's dying is the very you you've known for so many years. The career goals, the dreams of being recognized, the definitions of success. When all of that vanishes, you're left standing in a vast emptiness. I remember walking down a crowded street one day. People rushed past me, on phones, carrying laptops, discussing contracts. Everyone seemed to have a reason to run. And I just walked slowly, feeling like an outsider. The world moved to a rhythm I no longer belonged to. That moment was both painful and freeing. Painful, like losing an old home where I once lived. But freeing, because I realized that home was never real. It was a structure the ego had built for safety. And now that it had collapsed, I was forced to stand in the unknown. Maybe you felt this too, a sense of no longer driven, no longer certain, no longer guided by the map that once made everything seem so clear. This is exactly what Jung meant. When the unconscious becomes conscious, the ego loses its footing. It no longer knows what to live for. It's like an actor walking off stage, midway through the play, only to realize they have no lines outside the script. In those moments, we often think we've failed, or worse, that we've fallen into depression. But this is not the end. This is limbo, the in-between state, where the old has died and the new has yet to be born. People usually hate limbo. It feels meaningless, vague, like drifting with no direction. But Jung believed it's an essential part of individuation. No one can be reborn without first passing through this death. I remember trying to escape limbo. I went back to work, forced myself to set new goals, tried to reignite the old fire. But everything fell apart. No list excited me. No deadline made my heart race. And with every attempt, it became clearer. The old drive had truly died. That death wasn't a failure. It was freedom, though I didn't see it at first. Because that old drive had been the very chain keeping me locked in a meaningless game. Always running, always proving, yet never truly touching who I was. Now that it had fallen away, I had a chance to be still. Still enough to hear my own breath. Still enough to feel the trembling in my chest as I stood before the emptiness. And in that stillness, something else began to stir. Faint, but real. But before the new can be born, we must accept the death. Let the ego dissolve. Let the old map burn to ashes. Let ourselves drift in the unknown. This is the stage many people cannot get through. They panic, cling to the past, or shut down entirely. But if you dare to stay in limbo, you'll see. Emptiness is not the enemy. It is the doorway. A doorway to a new life, though no one can tell you where that doorway leads. And perhaps it is this not knowing, this mapelessness, that is the most sacred part of the journey. When the ego has died and the old map is erased, what will we do in that space? Will we panic and chase the old fire, or dare to wait for something sacred to quietly take root? Maybe you've felt this before. One day, you look around and realize you no longer have the drive to chase anything. The goals that once made your heart race now feel distant. Work, plans, even the dreams you once cherished, all of them have lost their pull. And you quietly ask yourself, what's happening to me? If you're in that place, know this. You're not alone. Jung called this phase a sacred pause. But in today's fast-paced world, it's often misunderstood. Society tells us that if we're not busy, we're wasting time. If we're not constantly producing or proving ourselves, we'll be left behind. So when you pause, when you fall into this stillness, you start to feel confused. People may call you lazy. And worse, you begin to doubt yourself. Am I falling apart? Am I broken? But here's the truth. You're not broken. You're passing through a rite of passage. A sacred transition that modern culture has forgotten. Think about it. In nature, nothing grows nonstop. Spring cannot last forever, or the trees would burn out. There must be winter, a season where life retreats into stillness to prepare for renewal. And yet we, trapped in the cycle of productivity and performance, have forgotten this natural rhythm. We've been taught to keep accelerating, to never stop, but awakening pulls you out of that race. It forces you to pause whether you want to or not. And it's in that pause that true rebirth begins. I remember sitting in a cafe one afternoon, watching the people around me tapping away at their laptops, phones buzzing, eyes tense with urgency. I suddenly realized I no longer belonged to that rhythm. Inside me, there was only silence. At first, I felt lost. But then came a very small moment, like when you're listening to music, and suddenly realize that the silence between two notes is what makes the melody so beautiful. The stillness after awakening is just like that. It is not the enemy. It's the pause between two chapters, allowing the next one to begin with greater wholeness. But to feel that, you have to learn to trust. Trust that this silence isn't meaningless emptiness. It's preparation. Trust that when all your old motivations collapse, something new will rise not from outside, but from deep within you. Maybe you're hearing these words now and nodding gently to yourself. Yes, I'm right there too. If that's the case, I want you to know you're not lost. You're walking a path that many deep souls, many seekers, many who dare to face themselves, have all walked. And you know what's heartbreaking? Very few people truly understand this. They'll say you've lost your drive, lost your direction, maybe even failed. But I want you to see this phase through different eyes. This is the beginning of a new way of living. If you've ever felt misunderstood, judged, or even judged yourself, remember this is not a full stop. It's a comma, opening the next chapter. And if you see yourself in these words, I invite you to share your story in the comments. You may be surprised at how many others are on a similar journey. Sometimes, just knowing we're not alone is enough to begin the healing. That's also why I created this channel. This space exists to make the invisible visible, to put words to the quiet experiences many people silently carry. If these words resonate with you, if they help you make sense of what's stirring inside, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Not for numbers, but because your interaction helps this message reach more souls who feel lost in the dark. Imagine this. Someone out there, disoriented after awakening, wondering if they're going crazy. And because you shared this, they stumbled across these words. Sometimes, one voice, one moment of resonance, can save a soul from drowning in loneliness. And maybe that's how you were saved too. So if you see your reflection in this message, stay connected to this space. Let's walk this journey together, not in haste, not in urgency, but slowly, through each sacred pause, until something new begins to bloom. Because as Jung reminded us long ago, these pauses are not wasteful. They are foundational. They are a necessary part of individuation, the process of being remade from within. And when you understand that, you will no longer fear the emptiness. You will embrace it, like winter, because you know spring will come. But before spring arrives, there is one strange phenomenon. Jung gave an unforgettable name, Enantiodromia. When the pendulum of your soul swings from frantic motion to complete stillness, what exactly is unfolding within you? There are moments in life when you feel like everything inside you is being turned upside down. The things that used to drive you, that used to get you out of bed each morning, suddenly vanish. In their place is a long silence, an emptiness that's hard to describe. Jung had a name for this. He called it Enantiodromia, the phenomenon where something, when taken to its extreme, flips into its opposite. And after awakening, this happens to the soul. Before, I lived on the extreme end of must-do. I had to achieve, to prove myself, to stay busy, to please everyone. Every morning my to-do list was like a chain yanking me out of bed. I felt alive, but in truth, I was being pulled by the momentum of it all, like a puppet. Then awakening happened, like an invisible snap. The pendulum inside me swung in the opposite direction. From I must do everything, it snapped to, why do anything at all? I remember one morning vividly. My laptop was open, the screen filled with unread emails. In the past, my heart would race, ready to dive into the day. But that day, I stared blankly. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, then dropped. I shut the laptop. No explanation. Just sat there, listening to the tick of the clock. That was the first time I truly felt my soul's power cord had been pulled. No motivation, no passion. I fell into a vast silence. And in that stillness, I began to understand. I had entered the phase of liquefying. You know the image of a caterpillar, right? When it enters the cocoon, it doesn't slowly grow wings like a fairy tale. It dissolves completely. Every familiar structure collapses into a shapeless liquid. It's no longer a caterpillar, not yet a butterfly, just a strange, messy goo. When I realized I was in that very state, I felt both terrified and surrendered. I was no longer the old me, but had no idea who I was becoming. I was simply melting. In this phase, the ego panics. It screams, we need a plan, an identity, a reason to exist. But the self whispers, not yet. Let me remake you from within. That tension made me feel like I was losing my mind. Some mornings I forced myself to rewrite my 5-year goals. The page stayed blank. I looked at it, and every image, the house, the car, the title, felt meaningless, like faded paintings that no longer moved me. In those moments, I remembered Jung's words. Humans cannot live by ego alone, because at some point, the ego runs dry. And when it does, we are brought face to face with the self. But to reach that place, we must dissolve. Liquefying is terrifying, because you have nothing to hold on to, no goals to chase, no identity to hide behind. You feel like you're drifting in an ocean, unable to tell which way is shore. I remember one evening, walking outside and watching people rush past. Everyone seemed to have a reason, meetings, deals, appointments, and I just stood still. No reason, no direction. In that moment, I felt invisible. And this invisibility, if you don't understand it, can feel like hell. But if you have the courage to sit quietly within it, you begin to see it as winter. Trees may look dead, but deep within, life is quietly preparing to bloom in spring. Enantiodromia is that winter, a necessary cycle where the soul shifts from hyperactivity to stillness, from do everything to do nothing. But remember, winter is not the end. It is the prelude to spring. Liquefying is the same. It doesn't destroy you. It prepares you for rebirth. I started calling this state something different. Not I'm lazy, not I'm broken, but I'm liquefying. And just by renaming it, I felt a bit lighter. Because if I'm liquefying, that means something else is happening beneath the surface. A quiet, unseen reconstruction. Jung believed that during this time, the unconscious has a chance to rise. Buried parts of the psyche begin to surface, and that is the real work waiting ahead. Shadow work, the work of facing what we've hidden. But before we can do that, we must accept one truth. We're no longer in control. We can't go back to being the busy little caterpillar. Nor can we force ourselves to become the butterfly overnight. All we can do is allow ourselves to melt, and trust that from the mess, something new will emerge. But when everything dissolves, what truly rises from within? That is when we must step into the darkest room of the soul where forgotten fragments lie waiting. Jung called that the shadow work. There's a truth about awakening that few people tell you. It doesn't just pull you out of illusion, it opens the door straight into the darkest room within you. That room holds everything you've ever rejected. The memories you tried to forget, the emotions you buried, the ugly parts of yourself you never dared to admit. And when the light of awareness shines in, all of it rises. Jung called this the shadow, the unseen side of the soul. I met my shadow unexpectedly. One night, while sitting in silence, childhood images flooded back. I saw myself, a little child, sitting alone in a small room, listening to my parents arguing behind the door. The fear and loneliness I thought I had buried long ago were still alive, waiting for this moment to return. And I realized, awakening is not just about opening your eyes to the light. It's about opening your eyes to the darkness you once avoided. We live in a society that glorifies positivity. We're told to stay optimistic, to smile, to move on. So when anger, jealousy, or sadness shows up, we quickly push them down. We hide them beneath busy schedules, new goals, or noisy distractions. But darkness doesn't disappear. It only sleeps. And awakening, in its quiet way, wakes it up. I used to think something was wrong with me when anger surfaced during meditation. My chest burned, my heart pounded, my throat tightened. In the past, I would have pushed it away, tried to stay calm, pretended it wasn't there. But this time, I let it be. I shook. I cried. And then, beneath the anger, I heard something else a cry, from the part of me that had been abandoned long ago. When I embraced it, something lifted. Not because the anger vanished, but because it had been seen. It had been acknowledged. Jung once said, "Light doesn't come from imagining beautiful images, but from making the darkness conscious." And it's true, every time I dared to look at a shameful part of myself, I discovered a hidden piece of gold beneath it. For example, behind the jealousy I once denied, I found a longing to be seen. Behind the shame, I found raw vulnerability. Behind the anger, I heard a plea from the inner child who had been left behind. And when I embraced those parts, I no longer had to split myself in two, one half allowed to exist, the other pushed into hiding. I began to become whole. This is shadow work, the real work, after awakening. Not plastering your walls with positive quotes, not running off to a new place, hoping for inspiration, but sitting with yourself, facing the darkness, and giving it space to speak. Many ancient cultures understood this. They had rites of passage that took people into the dark nights alone in the forest, rituals that forced them to face their deepest fears. Only after that were they considered adults. Modern life has lost those rituals. But awakening, in its own way, gives them back to us. It leads us into the forest of the soul, asking us to confront our own shadow. I remember a dream once. I was walking through a long, dark hallway. I was afraid and wanted to turn back, but my feet kept moving forward. At the end, there was a door. I opened it and found a room filled with light. But in the center of the room was a crying child, and I knew it was the part of me I had left behind. When I woke up, tears were still on my pillow. And I understood that dream wasn't random. It was my unconscious calling me back to embrace myself. Darkness is not the enemy. It is the forgotten part of the soul. And when we dare to return, to listen, we don't just heal, we discover power. There is a paradox here. The place that hurts the most is also where the gold is hidden. Jung believed that if we ignore the shadow, we miss our greatest treasure. That's why shadow work is not optional. It is the core of becoming whole. After each time I faced it, I felt motivation begin to return, but it was different this time. No longer frantic, no longer driven by fear. It felt like a quiet underground stream, slow, steady, guiding me to where I truly belong. And I realized that was the self, slowly rising. And then, from within the darkness, a new flame begins to glow. No longer the rushed fire of the ego, but a deeper, steadier light rising from the self. One morning, I woke up to the familiar silence. But unlike the days before, today there was a small, gentle stirring within me. It wasn't loud. It didn't push. It was like a delicate wave whispering, "Go outside. Take a breath. Let me guide you." I stepped into the street. Morning sunlight stretched across the empty road, golden light bathing the rooftops and trees. And for the first time in many months, I no longer felt like a stranger in this world. Something within me was quietly awakening. It wasn't urging me to run, to achieve, to prove. It was simply inviting me. Live. That was the moment I realized a new flame had been lit. Unlike the old kind of motivation, the kind that burned like gasoline, flaring fast and dying out, this flame was quiet and steady. It didn't push me to compete with anyone. It didn't demand recognition. It came from a deeper place, a center Jung called the self. The self doesn't ask you to play a role. It doesn't care about your job title, your possessions, or what others think of you. The self only asks, what is true for you? What stirs your heart? So I began to listen. I wrote, not to post, but because there was a story inside me that wanted to be told. I doodled little sketches, not beautiful, but honest. I called an old friend, not to prove I was okay, but simply to connect. These small actions brought a very different kind of joy. Not the loud excitement of adrenaline, but a quiet warmth, like a fire, gently heating a room on a cold night. Jung called this state symbolic life. When you live from the self, you are no longer swept up in external goals. Instead, you begin to listen to the subtle signals from within: dreams, intuition, strange coincidences, the soft tug in your chest. You stop asking, "What's my 5-year plan?" and begin to ask, "What is calling me right now?" And strangely, the answers are often very simple. It might be to make a warm cup of tea and sit in stillness for 10 minutes. It might be to write a few lines in your journal. It might be to say a long-held apology. To the outside world, these may seem like small, trivial acts, but inside, you feel the power of truth. One day, as I was writing, I realized I no longer wrote to impress. I no longer wrote for praise. I wrote because my heart quietly said yes. And in that moment, I cried. Not out of sadness, but because I realized I had found the flame again. Not the old fire of ego, but a steady inner glow, one that never goes out. And maybe you too will reach that day. A day when, after all the dissolving, something truly alive rises within you. A day when you walk not to prove anything, but to express something true. That flame might lead you to create, to heal, to teach, to build, to care. The form doesn't matter. What matters is that it comes from the most honest place inside you. Jung believed that when the self leads, life stops being a survival race and becomes a search for meaning. And that meaning is rarely found in grand milestones. It often hides in the most ordinary moments. A warm meal, a deep conversation with a friend, an afternoon sitting quietly, listening to the wind in the trees, a small decision made from the truth in your heart. When it comes from the self, every moment becomes sacred. I'm not saying that from now on, every day will be easy. You will still have tired mornings, confused nights, and moments of self-doubt. But one thing will be different. You will no longer feel like you are betraying yourself. Even in your fatigue, you will be living truthfully. And that is freedom. The self doesn't promise you a path lined with roses, but it offers you a compass. Not a compass that leads to outer glory, but one that leads you home. And when you return, you'll see motivation never really left. It simply changed form. From a raging fire that burned out, it became glowing embers, steady and enduring, warm enough to sustain you through a lifetime. I want to end this chapter of the journey with a line from Jung that once rang through me like a bell of awakening. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Awakening is not the end. It is the beginning, not of another race, but of a journey back home, back to the self where the true flame has always been burning. no matter how fierce the storm outside. Don't try to reignite the old fire. Let it burn out, because only then will you see the light that never left quietly burning in your deepest core. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.